Hello, welcome to one of the programs of the Iranian Renaissance movement, Children of Ferdowsi. You're watching the second series of our interview with Dr. Jaisun Jorjani. I'm glad to be his host in this discussion. We are going to continue the topic of the Iranian influence on the Greek philosophy and Greek culture in the next 25 to 30 minutes. So, Dr. Jorjani, welcome again to the program.
It's great to be with you again, Dr. Nejad.
Thank you very much. And I hope people who managed to watch our first session remember that we tried to talk about the Iranian influence on the Greek philosophy and also the significant impact that Iranian made on the way that Greeks used to think and push them somehow from being totally mythological to a kind of philosophical approach. That was more or less what was discussed last time. And also we talked about Heraclitus and the influence that he got from the Iranian culture and Iranian school of thoughts. Also, it was mentioned that letters were exchanged between Darius the Great and Heraclitus. And now we are going to touch a couple of more items regarding the important subject that we have been talking about. When we got to this stage, I think it's very relevant to bring up a very important figure, Pythagoras, or in Iranian literature we say Pythagoras. We know him as a philosopher, as a mathematician, and it will be interesting if Dr. Jorjani take us through this subject, that where he's standing in terms of beliefs, in terms of achievements, and especially where and how he was impacted by the Iranian school of thought. Dr. Jorjani, please.
Well, last time we talked about Heraclitus, and although he was invited by Darius the Great to become the court philosopher of the Hakamanashid Empire, he never actually made it to Iran. We had this little tangent on how it's interesting that he took refuge in the temple of Artemis and what Artemis meant in the context of ancient Iranian culture. At any rate, while Heraclitus did not make it to Iran, the other single greatest influence on the thought of Plato, the other predecessor of Plato who most influenced how his system of thought took shape, namely Pythagoras of Samos, actually did spend a decade in the capital of the Persian Empire. Pythagoras had traveled from his native island of Samos to Egypt, where he was studying in the temples with the Egyptian priests. And when Cambyses, or Cambyses II, Cambyses II, colonized Egypt and integrated it into the Persian Empire, he actually gave orders for Pythagoras to be arrested and brought to the capital of the Persian Empire. This is somewhat of a joke. Of course, what he meant by arresting him was that since the Persians were such seekers of wisdom, they wanted to bring this guy back to their capital and pick his brain and see what possibly he also could learn from them. So Pythagoras went to Babylon, which was the administrative capital of the Persian Empire at that time. And he, according to Iamblichus and Porphyry, who were two later Pythagorean authors, he spent 12 years studying with the Magi, or Moran, before returning to Samos. It's also noteworthy that Pythagoras returns to Samos only when the island is conquered by the Persian Empire. So I believe in 522, Samos comes under Persian rule, and in 520 BC, Pythagoras returns there. He spends about a decade there before moving to southern Italy, where he establishes a very revolutionary school of thought.
Dr. Jorjani, before you continue, could you please clarify for our audiences which king in Iran was simultaneous to the time interval that Pythagoras was in Iran?
Cambyses II, or Kambujiye Dovom.
Who's son of Cyrus the Great. Please.
So Pythagoras made it to southern Italy, where he established a very revolutionary school of thought. And one thing that we have to keep in mind is that we're talking really about a period before Heraclitus emerges as a major thinker. So there was no such thing as philosophy in Greece at all. And in fact, it's well known that Pythagoras was the first person to refer to himself as a philosopher. The term philosopher is coined by Pythagoras to refer to himself. Well, in Greek, there are a number of different words for love. There's eros, which refers to erotic love. There's agape, which refers to compassion. And philia, in particular, refers to friendship. So by saying that he is a friend of wisdom, or has a relationship of friendship toward wisdom, or mazda, he also is evoking a very unique relationship to God that is completely anathema to Greek religion and even to the Abrahamic faiths later on. In Zoroastrianism, there's this strange notion that man is a friend of God, and that God requires the friendship of man in order to unfold the plan of righteousness in the world. So I think that it's not incidental that philosophy, or the love of wisdom, emerges through Pythagoras only after he spends a decade in the capital of the Persian Empire. And the religion of the Persian Empire, in its native name, is known as wisdom worship, or mazda yasna, the reverence of wisdom. So this is just in terms of the name philosopher.
That's very interesting. In terms of vocabulary, I guess that was a point I hadn't paid attention to before. Philosophy, when it comes to the meaning, literally has a big affiliation with mazda yasna, exactly the meaning and also the tendency of the subject that they are going to raise and discuss. That's a good takeaway from this discussion, Dr. Jorjani.
It's also relevant in that regard that people like Porphyry and Iamblichus, the later Pythagorean biographers, tell us that although this man absorbed a number of influences from a variety of cultures, the Magi were very significant in shaping the religious outlook of the Pythagorean order of the society or school that Pythagoras set up. And I think one example of this is Pythagoras' teaching against animal sacrifice and even against cruelty towards animals. Some people had believed that there were folk tales that Pythagoras had reached India, but in fact, there's no good evidence to support these, or to support the idea that he went any further east than Babylon. So rather than seeing this as any kind of Hindu influence, it's much more likely that this is the influence of Zarathustra via the adoption of those elements in the Gathas that have to do with preaching against cruelty towards animals, preaching against animal sacrifice, which the Magi had adopted and were promulgating when Pythagoras was there studying in Babylon.
Interesting.
But more generally speaking than this simple point of doctrine of avoidance of animal cruelty, Pythagoras is known as a founder of mathematics, or as the founder of mathematics in the Western world. And something significant in this regard is that although he studied in the temples of Egypt, and we know, for example, that the Pythagorean theorem was probably noticed by him inside the king's chamber of the Great Pyramid, although the measurements that he took of various Egyptian monuments and his studies with the priests there may have influenced some of his development of mathematics, ancient Egyptian so-called mathematics is thoroughly mixed up with mythology. And so it doesn't really fit the proper Greek definition of mathesis, which is to be able to think axiomatically or formulaically without any reference to gods or symbols of that sort. And I think in this regard, we need to keep in view that the Greeks and Egyptians were always able to syncretize one another's gods. So, for example, Thoth in the ancient Egyptian pantheon was viewed by the Greeks as an equivalent to their Hermes, or the goddess Isis was syncretized with their goddess Aphrodite. So the contact that the Greeks had with the Egyptian culture really did not serve to break them out of mythological thinking in the way that their confrontation with the Persians did. Because you see, you were not able to syncretize Persian theology with Greek theology, because there were so many abstract principles in Zarathustra's vision of his cosmology and his ethics, that this represented a radically different cast of mind to the Greeks. I think beginning with Pythagoras in his time studying in Babylon. So when you're confronted with that degree of a clash in worldview, it turns out that you need to find a common denominator. You need to find some way of grasping the world that doesn't have a reference to the symbols of conflicting mythological systems. And that way of understanding the world more objectively or abstractly is, of course, mathematics.
Dr. Jorjani, before Pythagoras went to Iran, he spent some time in Egypt, and he worked on mathematics, as you mentioned. Since it's simultaneous to Cambyses ruling in Persia, and we know that Egypt was under rule of Persia in that period of time, even in Egypt, indirectly, he could have been influenced by the Persian school of thought. Am I right?
Yes, that's possible, especially because we have records that the Magi came to Egypt under Cambyses' rule. And in fact, the ancient Egyptians had a lot of problems with them because the Persians were trying to teach the Egyptians how to think abstractly.
That's true. What was Pythagoras' view toward creation? Because when it comes to comparing the cultures and the way of thinking, perhaps creation is a very major item. It's a foundation of different cultures. The approach of different ethnic group to the subject of creation could be itself initiator of many other beliefs later on. What was his view toward creation, and do we see any similarity between his view and what we had in the Persian Empire in that time, or before that, even before Persian Empire, in the Iranian environment?
We certainly do. At the core of Pythagoras' mathematics, there is this binary opposition between peros, or limit, and apeiron, or the unlimited. And the world is brought into being in a dynamic interaction between this principle of limit and the negatively unlimited, or the negatively infinite, in other words, chaos. So the place where we see this elaborated in greatest detail is actually a text of Plato that the majority of scholars believe is the most Pythagorean text that Plato wrote. It bears mentioning that Plato was, of course, a member of the Pythagorean order. After the death of Socrates, Plato joined the Pythagorean brotherhood. And this text of Timaeus, Plato's creation myth, quote unquote, is probably one of his most Pythagorean texts. There we see how a chaotic, unformed matter is shaped by mathematical principles of order and limit and proportion, so that the good creation can come into being, essentially. And the most renowned idea of Plato, the idea of uncorruptible, perfect, eternal archetypes or forms of all existing things, plants, animals, human beings. This has no precedent whatsoever in Greek thought, but it most definitely does in Zoroastrianism. In Zoroastrianism, in particular in the Bondheshn, we see that Ahura Mazda primordially creates a world of perfect archetypes in which there are the fravartis or fravashis or foruhars of human beings, their perfected forms, as well as the archetypes of plants and animals, in a state before they're assaulted by the chaotic and disorderly forces of the lie, the forces of darkness and derangement, as it were. So I think that it's intriguing that we have this comparison that we can draw between the much earlier cosmology of Zoroastrianism and the ideas that Plato absorbed via the Pythagorean order about the opposition between limit and the unlimited and the archetypal world and the way in which it shapes unformed and chaotic matter.
Interesting. When we talk about Farvahars and also archetype, I guess this is something that in the old text, Arabic text, they have been referred to as Mosul. Am I right?
That's right.
Okay. Thank you. We know that the big portion of the Greek world was under ruling, or at least under influence of Persia during the centuries that we are following our topic or discussion subject. It's a shame if we talk about creation and other essential parameters of the culture and we ignore the political philosophy or political school of thought. Since these people who were genius, they witnessed the way Iranian rule the world or the portion of world that they had in under their influence. What they got from the Iranian side in terms of political philosophy and what elements went into their system of political philosophy, which became somehow later on indirectly the predominant political philosophy in the West in the recent centuries.
Well, on the way to answering that question, I think we should first draw a comparison between the traditional Greek forms of politics, the customary ways in which the Greeks ordered their societies, or the ways in which the Greek society was often disordered, and the kind of political philosophy or doctrine of governance that we had in ancient Iran long before the classical Greek epoch. The Greeks had essentially three traditional forms of government. One was democracy, which the Athenians, of course, have made famous subsequently in the history of the West. Another was oligarchy, or the rule of a group of wealthy people. A third is timocracy, or essentially a military dictatorship. And they alternated between these three forms of government. What would often happen is you would have a democracy that wound up being taken advantage of by wealthy people within the society who manipulated ignorant masses in order to establish an oligarchy. And then maybe some champion of the people would rise up from out of the military and depose the oligarchs and establish a military dictatorship. And of course, what I forgot to mention was you also had a pure tyranny, the rule of one absolute dictator. Mm-hmm. In Iran, in ancient Iran, for centuries before the classical Greek period, there was the notion of the alliance between the philosopher and the king. And this goes back to the Gathas of Zarathustra and to Zarathustra's own relationship with Kavi Vishtaspa or Ke Goshtasp. In the Gathas, we see Zarathustra talk about an alliance between the crown and the sage or the wise man for the benefit of properly ordering the world. and having a system of sovereignty grounded on the reverence for wisdom. Well, what Pythagoras does when he moves his school to southern Italy is he trains the sons of the aristocracy and attempts to restructure the government there along the following lines. He proposes that instead of the masses governing in a democracy, or instead of a military dictatorship, the wise should rule, people who are competent and expert in various fields under the chairmanship, perhaps, of a single philosopher. And this winds up influencing Plato's proposal for establishing a philosopher kingship in his famous text Republic. So this idea of the guardianship of the wise is one that, again, has no precedent in Greek thought and that we do see in ancient Iran. It met with ferocious resistance. Eventually, there was a coup where the feudal lords of the southern Italian countryside burned down the Pythagorean schools. And Pythagoras either died in that fire or he barely escaped it and died of his injuries shortly thereafter. Interestingly, Plato also tries to actually implement his concept of a philosopher kingship in Syracuse, and almost is martyred in the process as well. He has to escape Syracuse in the middle of the night in disguise because this idea was really something that the Greeks were unaccustomed to and viewed with a great deal of suspicion. The idea that you could be benevolently guided by a group of people who had attained wisdom and were going to reorder the world along well thought out principles.
Dr. Jorjani, this philosopher kingship that perhaps is a pure Iranian belief or model, can we consider what has been portrayed as Kay Khosrow in Shahnameh as a philosopher kingship representative? Remember, when we talk about philosophy, perhaps in this particular topic, mainly we refer to wisdom. So Kay Khosrow in Shahnameh, in our national epic, or in the more documented history, can we refer to Ardeshir Babakan and also Anushiravan as representatives of philosopher kingship, which became a kind of model for what later on became famous as Plato doctrine for ruling the society?
Yes, I certainly think so. And it's interesting how people talk about Khosrow Anushiravan as if he was a Platonist, that he was some sort of Neoplatonist who was learning from the Greek philosophers who had taken refuge in the Persian Empire after the Christians shut down their schools in Rome. Well, we have to think about where this idea came from in the first place. Perhaps Khosrow Anushiravan was inviting the Platonic philosophers to the Sasanian court because he identified with their doctrine of philosopher kingship, essentially since it has Iranian origins.
Absolutely.
In other words, he was welcoming them back home.
Yeah. And the model that you refer to in Gata of Zarathustra, integrated work of Gushtasp, the king, and Zarathustra himself, I guess is something that more and less in several occasions during the Iranian history we observed, and we can maybe bring up some examples like Anushiravan and Bozorgmer or some other faces. So that seems a kind of ideal team to rule the country. Perhaps when we talk about these cases, we are talking about one wise man and one king who work together in an idealized situation. But in today's world, it might be a team of rulers and a team of wise men who can really come up with a comprehensive plan and practice for ruling the country and perhaps moving toward the progress and development of the society.
Indeed, and the most revolutionary aspect of the political system that Plato intends his philosopher kings to unfold in Greek society is the equality of women, or at least the equal opportunity of women to serve in all capacities in the society. This again is an idea that has no precedent in Greek society. Some people have suggested that possibly this is a sign of Spartan influence, that perhaps Plato was looking to the position that women had in Spartan society. But women in Spartan society were only marginally more free than in Athenian society. They had the kind of independence that frontiers women did in the old American West, because Sparta was a militaristic society where men were often at war, and so the women had to be relatively more resourceful in order to man the homestead, as it were. But if we really want to look at the society in Plato's time, where women had a completely different status than in Athens, where they had no political rights at all, no property rights, where the most accomplished and independent women were prostitutes, then we'd have to look at the Hachämonid Empire. Women in the Hachämonid Empire were property holders. They had their own estates. They had people employed on those estates. And if we look at the records that are signed with their own personal seals and the letters that these women wrote, we can see that women were even paid equally to men for specialized labor. We also know from Greek accounts that are rather critical of the Persians that Persian women had a tremendous influence on the male leaders of the Hachämonid Empire, all the way from the kings to the courtiers and military leaders. The Greeks used to mock the Persians for being under the thumb of their women. In the eyes of the Greeks, Persian women were basically running the show. And we also have even a few examples where Persian women were commanders in the military, whether in the army, in the Immortal Guard, or in the Persian Navy. This was extraordinary by the standards of the Greeks, and I think that if we want to look for a prototype for Plato's vision of women receiving an equal education and serving in the capacity not only of intellectual leaders of the society, but also even in the military, then we would have to look at ancient Iran.
That's interesting. Also, you mentioned Persepolis and women labor group who used to work there, and they got paid as equal as their main counterparts. Also, I saw documents, perhaps extracted from Persepolis. The translation was regarding maternity leave for female laborers, which I think in the Greek society, not even similar, not even they got closer to this level of being considerate regarding women and trying to treat them fairly for 25 centuries ago. Dr. Jorjani, when it comes to the influence, sometimes there are cases that people may consider it as contradiction to what we have been talking in the past 20-25 minutes. For instance, we know lie is one of the worst things in Iranian culture, in ancient Iranian culture. Lying is definitely one of the worst things that a person can do. We know that in the Iranian literature, in the oldest one, in Gata, lie has been mentioned, and people have been warned regarding this sin, lying. Also, Darius the Great, in one of his famous sentences, he wishes that his land, his country, be protected from lie. How come Plato, as a person who has been under influence of Iranian culture or school of thought, he brought up something like noble lie? How can we explain it?
Well, we have to look at the context in Plato's Republic, where he advances this idea of a noble lie. And it's very curious. He says that the only context in which lies are really acceptable is as stratagems or tactics in combat, in some kind of a military confrontation, or in terms of, let's say, an intelligence operation against the enemy. And the question is, who is the enemy here? Well, if you look through the Republic, there's a sustained critique of Homeric epic poetry and the kind of moral values that it is inculcating in the Greek youth. Plato comes very close on a number of occasions to saying that the Homeric myths are lies and that they are corrupting the minds of the youth. And because this was such a dangerous thing to say, his own teacher, Socrates, was executed on charges of impiety for at least being suspected of preaching against the Olympian pantheon. Because this was such a dangerous thing to say, Plato has to be very careful about how he says it. And what he winds up claiming is that we cannot accept that God would shape, shift, change forms in order to deceive people the way that Zeus often assumes the forms of animals to rape human women and produce his heroic offspring. We cannot accept these as true stories, because if we do, they will corrupt the morals of the youth. And besides, we don't know very much about what happened in those old days anyway, so let's take these fables and spin them in a way that will be more constructive for the cultivation of virtue among the youth. At its most incisive, this critique comes to the verge of claiming that there is a God and that this God is a liar. And so Plato is using the noble lie as a stratagem or tactic in order to combat a God or Godfather who is a liar. There's a very striking passage that I'd like to just very briefly read to you. It's from 381e to 382a in Plato's Republic. He says, quote, "Nay, no fool or madman is a friend of God. Then there's no motive for God to deceive, none. So from every point of view, the divine and the divinity are free from falsehood. God is altogether simple and true in deed and word, and neither changes himself nor deceives others by visions or words or the sending of signs in waking or in dreams. You concur then, as our second norm or canon for speech and poetry about the gods, that neither are they wizards in shape-shifting, nor do they mislead us by falsehoods in word or deed." Okay, well, the very messenger or courier of Zeus is Hermes, the trickster, liar, and thief. So what kind of a god is this who employs a career trickster and liar as his messenger to humanity? Obviously, Plato knows that the god of the Greeks is a deceiver. He's seen this, I think, because he's under Persian influence, perhaps via the Pythagorean order, and has recognized that kind of a divine tyrant as essentially what Zarathustra saw Ahriman, or the great deceiver, to be, the promulgator of the lie, to be.
Okay, so noble lie, according to Plato, we can say somehow it was fitted for that particular purpose. It wasn't a general term.
Well, it reveals something far more profound, which is that Plato has recognized the god of the Greeks to be a liar.
And it was.
This is a shattering, culturally catastrophic recognition. And so in response to this, in response to waging a military conflict with a divine being who is a deceiver and manipulator, he advocates the use of deception.
So in that case, noble lie not only is not a contradictory to the Iranian influence on Plato, somewhat it confirms it even further.
I would say so.
Dr. Jorjani, thank you very much for your great contribution to this discussion. And I hope we can continue this interesting topic in the very near future.
It was a pleasure to be with you again, Dr. Nejad.
Thank you.